Hey folks, previously we removed the rear suspension from the Basket Case BMW. Then we refreshed the rear subframe and reinstalled it. Now we're going to finish the rest of the rear suspension. Before we start, I want to make a comment. When I removed the rear suspension, I took some shortcuts to make the job go faster. Unfortunately, that came back to haunt me. You'll see why in a moment. Anyway, let's get started. First of all, I want to install the control arms and the camber arms. Let's start with the camber arms. Before installing them, I adjusted them to match the stock ones. To do that, I put a couple long bolts through the stock camber arm and adjusted the new one until it lined up with the bolts. They have these funny looking nuts that need to be inserted into the subframe. When you tighten the bolt, that nut wedges itself in place, so you don't need to hold it with a wrench. That was easy enough. At this point, I decided to install the shock absorbers. To be honest, I'm not sure why I decided to do that at this point, but let's roll with it. On the rear suspension, the shock absorber does not set the ride height, but it does set the maximum droop, which is how far down the suspension can hang. It can also be used to put preload on the springs. I decided to measure the length of the original shocks when fully extended, and subtract an inch because I plan to reduce the ride height about an inch. I can adjust that in the future if necessary. When I went to install the shocks, I had a little problem. My arms weren't long enough to reach into the car and install the mounting nuts while also holding the shock in place. Yeah, I failed at giving my car the reach around. So instead, I had to jack it. What were you thinking? Anyway, let's move on to the upper control arms. They had rubber bushings in them, so I'm going to replace them with polyurethane. But there are a couple things to note. First of all, the control arms are different, so you have to make sure you don't get the right and left side mixed up. I didn't see any markings that signify left and right, so I used a Sharpie marker. Second of all, the bushings are not symmetrical either. The bushing sticks out more on one side than the other, so I made an arrow pointing to the bigger side. Removing those bushings was a pain in the neck. First I tried pressing them out, but that didn't work and I didn't want to damage the control arms, so I had to cut the bushings out. First I drilled out the rubber part with a hole saw. Then I used a hacksaw to cut a slot in the metal sleeve and used a chisel to remove it. The control arm is made of aluminum, so you have to be really careful not to damage it. Okay, now we can install the urethane bushings. Keep in mind where the bigger end needs to go. Once again, the arrow points to the big side. I was able to push in the urethane bushings by hand, but the metal sleeves needed a few love taps with a rubber mallet. I also decided to install the end links into the control arms before putting the control arms in the car. It's easier that way. The end link brackets need to be installed a certain way. That metal tab in the middle needs to be facing the center of the car. Also, the end links for the white line sway bar need to be installed a certain way. One end is smaller than the other. The bigger end goes in the bracket. And here we have the end link installed in the control arm. Once again, that metal tab points to the center of the car. Installing the upper control arm is simple enough. Just line it up with the bolt holes and insert the bolt. This bolt uses a regular nut, so you'll need to counterhold it with a wrench. Next up is the trailing arms. The outer bushings for the control arms are installed in the trailing arm and need to be pressed out. The original bushings were a monoball for the upper control arm and a rubber bushing for the camber arm. I'm going to replace both of them with monoball bushings. Remember what I said about cutting corners to save myself some work? Yeah, that came back to haunt me. You may have noticed the axle, the wheel hub, and the brake rotor shield are still attached to the trailing arm. Trying to press out the bushings is a lot more difficult with all that stuff attached to the trailing arm. I ended up having to remove the parking brake hardware so I could loosen up the brake rotor shields and move them out of the way. But the added weight of the axle and the hub still made the job a lot more difficult. You can learn from my mistakes, so you don't have to repeat them. We're going to skip forward a little bit because I was so busy riding the struggle bus, I forgot to switch on the camera. Anyway, I cleaned up and repainted the trailing arms. I used a Dremel with a flap wheel to clean out the holes for the bearings. I installed the new bushings by hand because trying to hold the trailing arm just right in the hydraulic press, with all the extra weight hanging off it and getting the new bushing pressed in without slipping and damaging something, seemed almost impossible. So I used a long bolt with a coupling nut and a few washers as a makeshift press. My wheel bearing kit didn't have any pressing dies small enough, so I used some old hole saws that I don't care about anymore. At this point, I should probably say, don't try this at home. Next, we're going to install the trailing arm bushings. These are monoball bushings from Moog. They're made for a Toyota Camry, but people say they fit in an E46. Also, there's a guy in the E46 Fanatic forum who sells a kit to make the install easier. The kit includes a flap wheel to clean out the trailing arm, a couple adapter sleeves for the bolt holes, and a pressing die that will perfectly center the bushing in the trailing arm. I'll put a link to the kit down below. First, I used the flap wheel to clean out the hole for the bushing. People say the Camry bushings are slightly larger in diameter than the E46 ones. We're talking a fraction of a millimeter. So I used the flap wheel to ream out the bushing hole a little bit. Also note that the bushing has a flat side and an angled side. The pressing die goes against the flat side. The angled side gets pressed into the trailing arm. First I tried pressing it by hand using the big bolt and stuff, but that didn't work very well. The bushings didn't want to go in straight, they kept tilting to the side. So I had to use the hydraulic press anyway. I had to be super careful to keep everything lined up properly while trying to hold the trailing arm at an awkward angle with the axle flopping around. It was not fun. But anyway, here's how that pressing die works. You press in the bushing until the outer lip of the pressing die touches the trailing arm. That's it. The bushing is now perfectly centered. Here's another view of that so you can see what I'm talking about. Okay, now we need to modify the mounting brackets. The Camry bushings are slightly wider than the E46 ones. It's only about a millimeter or so, but it's enough to prevent the bracket from fitting on the bushing. So I'm going to use a bolt and a couple nuts to spread the sides apart. It doesn't take much. After I was happy with the fit, I put the adapter sleeve in the bushing and installed the bracket. The bolt hole in the Camry bushing is larger than the E46. That adapter sleeve lets you reuse the E46 mounting bolt. Alternatively, you could drill out the bolt holes in the bracket and use bigger bolts. It's up to you. Next, we're going to install the suspension springs. The BC Racing springs have a warning label that says to install the adjuster on top of the spring. So for once, I'm actually going to follow the instructions. But first I noticed the springs didn't fit correctly on the control arms. There was a lot of empty space and the spring was able to move around a lot. I didn't like that. So just out of curiosity, I tried fitting the stock spring pads to see if that would help, and they fit perfectly. Unfortunately, the BC Racing instructions didn't say anything about this. Anyway, installing the springs was simple enough. Same goes for the adjuster. Here's another area where the BC Racing instructions were lacking. They're not very clear about adjusting the ride height or the spring preload. They say the shock body needs to be threaded onto the bottom piece at least 25 millimeters, but they don't say anything about the height adjuster. So I threaded the adjusting collar 25 millimeters onto the adjuster. I can readjust it later if necessary. Okay, we're almost ready to install the trailing arms, but I had to address a couple small issues. First of all, the new camber arms don't use cam bolts to adjust the camber. I imagine you could reuse the bolts, but they can't be used to adjust the camber anymore. That might confuse the alignment tech. So I replaced them with regular bolts. Also, the shock absorber bolts don't have washers because the original shocks have the washer built in. So I bought a couple washers for those bolts. Anyway, let's get those trailing arms installed. Once again, having all that extra stuff attached to the trailing arms made things much more difficult. I had to hold my tongue just right to get that first bolt to line up, but after that it was all downhill. Also, I had to finagle the brake caliper through the control arms and the axle to get it back into its proper place. And I had to make sure the brake line was routed properly. And after that it was basically just bolting everything back in. I won't make you sit through all that. And here's the end result. The suspension and brakes are reinstalled, or at least mostly. You may have noticed the rear sway bar and the rear differential are missing. I ran out of time to install those, so we'll have to cover that in the next video. Thanks for watching.